In today's video, Magnus Carlsen crushes Vidit Gujrathi with the Modern Benoni opening at the 2023 Speed Chess Championships. Now in the game, Vidit opens 1d4 and Magnus Carlsen heads straight for the Modern Benoni with the moves knight f6, then c4 from Vidit, and finally c5 from Magnus Carlsen, a very provocative choice. Now the Modern Benoni does give white a very powerful pawn center if he goes d5, expanding in the center, and that is what Vidit does in the game. So, d5, and now here Magnus Carlsen, in the future, he is going to try to challenge that pawn on d5, likely with the move e6. However, he does delay that move for a little while. Here he goes g6, intending bishop g7 and short castles, and effectively giving Vidit the chance to take control of the center with the moves knight c3 and e4, and giving Vidit a very free game. Alright, Vidit goes knight c3, bishop g7, and then e4 on the board. Vidit getting that very powerful pawn center on c4, d5, and e4, but Magnus again will likely challenge it with the move e6 at some point in the future, threatening e takes d5. Alright, now Magnus d6, and here Vidit of course has a choice. What kind of setup does he want to go for against the Modern Benoni? Well, in the game, he chooses a very simple one involving bishop e2, knight to f3, and short castles. A very good choice against Magnus Carlsen's provocative opening. Alright, now bishop e2 on the board, then we have short castles, then knight to f3, and finally here in this position, Magnus Carlsen challenges that pawn on d5 with the move e6. Now the main idea for Magnus Carlsen here, he wants to go e takes d5, opening up the e-file for his rook on the soon-to-be e8 square and trying to counterplay against white's center. Now from there, white will have the option of recapturing with the c-pawn or the e-pawn, so we'll have to wait and see what Vidit wants to do. In the game, Vidit just castles, Magnus takes on d5, e takes d5 on the board, and here instead of e takes d5, that would be more of a symmetrical type of position. Here Vidit does go c takes d5. He wants an imbalanced game where he can play for a win against the world champion Magnus Carlsen. Now here in this position, if Magnus wants to go bishop g4, challenging that knight on f3, then he has to do it immediately. This may be his last chance to do it, as Vidit will have ideas like h3 or knight d2 in the future, taking away that option from Magnus. Now in the game, Magnus does not go bishop g4, instead rook to e8 on the board, a very standard idea in the Modern Benoni. Again, going e takes d5, opening up the e-file, then rook to e8, capitalizing on the semi-open e-file. And now Vidit, he goes for my personal favorite variation against the Modern Benoni. That involves the immediate knight d2. Now this is a very, very strong idea. Again, it is one of white's strongest and most powerful weapons against the Modern Benoni. The idea is you want to head for a Saemisch-style structure with the pawns on f3, e4, and d5. From there, the knight goes to c4, and then you slow play the position with moves like a4, king to h1, perhaps bishop e3 or bishop g5, queen d2, and so on. And eventually you do want to start an attack on the king side with moves like f4, and then eventually e5. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, what is he going to do about this plan? He starts knight to a6. The idea being he wants to go knight c7, and then threatening b5, expanding on the queenside. Here, Vidit, he continues king to h1, a very standard idea in this variation. Again, the main moves first are knight c4, king h1, f3, and a4 for white. Now here, Magnus, knight c7. Vidit continues f3 in the spirit of the Saemisch variation against the king's Indian defense. And now Magnus, I thought he would go, say, a6 and rook b8, threatening b5, expanding on the queenside. But instead, he plays a completely different idea that I did not expect in this position. And when I first saw this, I was completely shocked. He went b6 in this position. You almost never go b6 in the Modern Benoni. But of course here, Magnus does have an idea. Here, Vidit goes a4, expanding on the queenside, and Magnus goes rook b8. A very curious idea. Why would you go b6 and then rook b8 in this manner? Well, we're about to find out. Here, Vidit goes knight to c4, the standard idea in this variation against the Modern Benoni. And now here, Magnus Carlsen, he shows his idea. He waited for Vidit to go knight c4, blocking off the bishop from controlling the a6 square. And now that he went there, Magnus goes bishop to a6, threatening bishop takes c4. His idea is he wants to give up his light-squared bishop for that knight being very, very strong, and the bishop on c8 or a6 right now being very, very weak. And from there, Magnus Carlsen's remaining minor pieces, those two knights and the dark-squared bishop, will be very, very active. So this is his plan, giving up the light-squared bishop for that knight on c4. Alright, here Vidit goes bishop g5, a very standard idea in these Saemisch-style positions, putting pressure on that knight on f6 and pinning it to the queen on d8. And here Magnus, he just goes for his idea. Bishop takes c4, giving up the bishop outright. Now we have bishop takes, and then a6. Now Magnus is potentially threatening b5, expanding on the queenside. Again, that is the standard idea in these modern Benoni structures. So with that in mind, here Vidit, he just goes queen d3, clamping down on that b5 square with the queen, the bishop, and that pawn on a4. Now, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing here to continue increasing the pressure on the queen side? Well, it turns out he has a few different good ideas. First of all, the immediate move b5 is actually playable. That is a pawn sacrifice, but you do open up lines on the queen side to attack. And beyond that, h6 trying to drive back that bishop from the g5 square is also very playable, but instead here in this game, Magnus Carlsen goes for a completely different idea that I did not expect again. Here he goes queen to c8. The idea being he wants to go queen b7 and then increasing the pressure on that b5 square, threatening b5 in the future. All right, the problem with this move, and Vidit does spot it immediately, is the queen no longer controls that d6 square. That d6 pawn is now undefended, and here Vidit just drops back the bishop, bishop f4, targeting that weak pawn and increasing the pressure on it and getting out of the way of a future h6 idea from Magnus. All right, now Magnus, he has a variety of ways to defend that pawn on d6. For example, bishop f8, very playable. Instead, he goes rook d8, defending with the rook, but also getting the rook off the semi-open e-file, where it's a little bit less active on d8. Now here Vidit, in this position, he should be thinking about getting play on the queen side, believe it or not. There's simply no good way to attack on the king side yet. For example, rook fb1, or even better, rook ab1 is likely the best idea. The idea being perhaps you want to go b4, try to open up lines on the queen side. However, instead, Vidit plays a very aggressive idea on the king side. These Indian superstar chess players, they just love to attack. Here in this position, Vidit goes g4, expanding on the king side. The idea being he potentially wants to go g5 or perhaps h4 to h5, try to open up lines against Magnus Carlsen's king. A very provocative idea. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, what does he do about this new threat by Vidit? Well, for the time being, he actually ignores the threat and just goes queen to b7, threatening b5 on the very next move. And if he gets that move in, he will have that 2 versus 1 pawn majority on the queen side with those pawns on b5 and c5 versus the 1 pawn on the b2 square. All right, now Vidit, what should he be doing about this growing threat of b5 from Magnus Carlsen, expanding on the queen side and driving back that bishop? Well, it turns out the best idea here is simply moving the queen. That way your bishop can go back to d3 or the e2 square. So where should the queen go? Well, personally, queen d2 looks like the most logical square to me. You get the queen back here, you threaten bishop h6. It's a very standard attacking idea. However, instead, in the game, Vidit actually goes queen to c2 here. And for the life of me, I just cannot understand the idea behind this move. Maybe you can figure it out. Let me know in the comment section below if you understand why queen c2 was the move here for Vidit, instead of the more logical looking move at first glance, queen d2. Now here in the game, Magnus expands on the queen side with move b5, driving back the bishop. Here Vidit takes on b5, a takes, then a takes. Very logical, opening up the a file for the rook. He does control the a file for now. And then bishop e2, retreating the bishop back to a very safe square. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he does not slow down. In this game, he goes queen to b6, and this is a very, very strong idea, and it's very deep. The idea being, he wants to take control of the a-file, perhaps with the move rook to a8, challenging Vidit's rook on the a1 square. However, if he did that immediately, let's go back here half a move. In this position, if Magnus went rook to a8 immediately, he would lose control of that d6 square. For example, rook a8, then rook takes, then rook takes. If he played that rook takes move, then suddenly that pawn on d6 is undefended, and bishop takes d6 would win the pawn, and maybe even the game. So, queen b6, a very subtle move, over defending the pawn on d6, and then threatening rook to a8 with the recapture with the rook. Now here Vidit, in this position, he really has to think about either slowing down the attack on the queen side or getting his own king side attack going. If he wants to attack on the king side, the move is going to be g5, gaining more space and trying to drive back that knight off the very good f6 square. Instead here, he simply goes knight d1, and this turns out to be quite a bit slower. The idea being you want to get out of the way of the future b4 advance from Magnus Carlsen. However, knight d1 is a little bit slow, although Vidit does have a very interesting rerouting idea for the knight. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, knight d7 on the board, a very good rerouting of the knight. The idea being either the knight's going to the e5 square, or he wants to go c4 and then knight to c5, with the knight jumping in on c5, maybe even jumping into either b3 or d3 in the future. Now here, Vidit, he continues his rerouting process with his knight on d1. He goes knight to f2, And while the knight is not super active yet, it is on a decent square, and from f2 it may go to d3 or even to g4 after the g5 pawn advance from Vidit. So now Magnus c4 on the board, very good idea, opening up that c5 square for his knight. And now Vidit, he really has to think about g5, intending knight to g4, threatening ideas like knight to h6 and knight to f6 in the future. That would be the best continuation of this g4 idea he played earlier in the game. However, instead here, he just gives up control of this a file. He goes rook a to d1, and while this move does get the rook off this open diagonal here, and now Vidit can threaten ideas like b3 or b4, there is that idea behind it. However, overall, giving up control of that a file was a big mistake in this position. Now Magnus Carlsen, he just goes rook to a8, taking control of that a file and punishing Vidit for moving the rook away from the a1 square. Now here Vidit, b3, continuing his idea, he's going rook to d1 and then b3 with the rook off this open diagonal with the bishop. But now here Magnus Carlsen, he just goes c3, expanding on the queenside and cementing that c-pawn as a permanent protected pawn on the queenside. Now Vidit, he does not want to allow b4 from Magnus Carlsen. He is not in the mood for that move at all. So with that in mind, he goes b4, expanding on the queenside and trying to disconnect Magnus Carlsen's pawns on the queenside as well. But however here, Magnus Carlsen, he just jumps in with the rook to the a4 square, rook to a4 on the board. A very strong idea, pressuring b4 of Vidit, threatening rook takes b4, and if that pawn falls, Magnus Carlsen will have two passed pawns on the queenside, and that will just be overwhelming. All right, here Vidit, knight d3 on the board, defends the pawn, likely the best idea, but now knight to a6 for Magnus Carlsen, again increasing the pressure on that b pawn, and now Magnus also opens up the c file for this rook. Potentially he's going to go rook to c8, and then maybe even fly in with the rook onto the c4 square. All right, Vidit, queen b3, once again defends the pawn with a second piece. Now we have the knight and the queen versus the rook and the knight that are attacking and defending that pawn on the b4 square. But now Magnus, rook c8 on the board. The rook is very active on the c file, again potentially threatening c2 ideas or rook to c4 ideas, piling up on that poor b pawn. All right, Vidit, rook c1 on the board, getting out of the way of future c2 ideas. But now Magnus jumping in with the rook to c4, and how is Vidit going to defend that b pawn? Well, in the game, he goes rook to a1, trying to decrease the pressure by getting rid of one of Magnus Carlsen's attacking pieces, and Magnus does take on a1. You do not want to allow rook takes a4, so rook takes a1, then rook takes. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he finds an absolutely brilliant idea to increase the pressure on the queenside. And if you like tactical puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find this beautiful shot by Magnus Carlsen in this position. All right, I hope you found it. In this position here, Magnus, he jumps in with the knight and he just takes on b4. Knight takes b4. Now, this is a brilliant move because here Vidit, he can technically just take the knight with his own knight, and if rook takes, then queen takes, and he's simply winning a piece. So what is the idea behind knight takes b4? Is Magnus Carlsen just giving up a piece for absolutely nothing? Well, it turns out no, he is not. This is a brilliant idea. All right, here Vidit, he takes on b4, knight takes b4 on the board, but then Magnus Carlsen, he jumps in with the queen to the incredibly dangerous f2 square, queen to f2 on the board, and this is the idea of knight takes b4. Now the queen is targeting that bishop on e2, and potentially has ideas like bishop d4, threatening ideas on the g1 square. So Magnus Carlsen just piling up the threats in the center and the queen side and even on the king side. Now real fast, if you're enjoying this content, go and smash that YouTube like button for me. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. Now here, Vidit, how does he defend? In the game, he goes rook to a2, trying to defend the bishop on e2 with the rook, a very logical idea. However, the drawback of this move, the rook is no longer on the back rank, and that means Magnus Carlsen can jump in with his bishop to the d4 square, bishop d4 on the board, and now Magnus, the audacity, threatening checkmate in one move with queen to g1. How is Vidit going to defend? Well, it's not easy. Here it goes queen d1, trying to bring his queen back to the defense, but that gives up the control of the b4 knight. Now, real fast, if you go queen to b1, trying to defend that g2 square and the knight on b4. Of course, the queen is going to be overloaded. Then you just go, say, rook takes b4, and if the queen takes, then it's checkmate. So either way, you are going to lose that knight on the b4 square, and that was the whole idea of knight takes b4 in the first place. Magnus Carlsen saw after knight takes, and then queen to f2, the threats would be overwhelming, and Magnus would win that piece back in the end. So here, queen d1 on the board, then rook takes b4, winning back the piece. And now Magnus Carlsen, he's officially up a pawn on the queen side. He has those two pass pawns. That is going to be incredibly dangerous for Vidit. All right, Vidit, bishop g3, hitting the queen, then queen to e3, getting out of the attack. Now Vidit, he picks up that pawn on d6. Bishop takes d6. Now Vidit has equalized the material. However, the big problem is those pass pawns on the queen side. They are just so far advanced and so dangerous. And now Magnus, rook b2 on the board, very strong, hitting both the rook on the a2 square and that bishop on e2. If the rook moves, say, rook to a1, then rook takes e2, wins the bishop, and likely the game. So you have to take on b2. Rook takes b2 on the board, c takes b2, and now the big threat for Magnus Carlsen is going to be queen to c1. That move would pin the queen on d1 to the king on h1. You cannot move with the queen, and beyond that, he's also threatening b1, promoting to a queen. And even worse, if you take the queen on c1, queen takes c1, then b takes c1, promotes to a new queen, you essentially lose your own queen for nothing. So what is Vidit going to do to stop this threat? Well, there's very little he can do. In the game, he goes bishop d3. This is the final mistake. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he jumps in with the queen. Queen to c1. The threats are overwhelming. He's threatening queen takes d1. The queen is pinned. And again, if you take on c1, b takes c1, promotes to a queen. And for that reason, in this position, Vidit Gujrathi, the Indian superstar, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his Modern Benoni opening. Wow, what a game by Magnus and Vidit Gujrathi. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here where Praggnanandhaa sacrifices 2 rooks against Magnus Carlsen. That really was the game of the year in 2022, so check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.